So this talk will be recorded and it will be sent out to attendees afterwards once we get it uploaded. So I hope that you will join us in 2 weeks for our talk on February 28th, Dressing Up, the Women Who Influenced French Fashion. And then March 28th, we have a talk on a curator-led tour at Poster House of their brand new exhibition opening later this month on Ethel Reed March. And we also have 2 other calls out. Sorry, my internet is apparently very unstable at the moment. But we have a few calls out. We're looking for emerging scholars proposals for our talk in May. We are also looking for calls for our micro grants for our Margot Gale Fund. And I'm going to put links for all of this in the chat so that you can find them later. And now I would like to introduce our speaker tonight. Rachel Feltman is the executive editor of Popular Science, where she also—
You're breaking up quite a bit.
Okay. Let's see if I turn off my video. And this will transfer over to Rachel, and so we should be good in just a few moments. Okay, so back to my introduction. Rachel is the executive editor of Popular Science, where she also hosts the hit podcast, The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week. She has written for Scientific American, The Washington Post, Quartz, Popular Mechanics, and The Atlantic on everything. Okay, I am just going to turn it over to Rachel. Apologies for my crummy internet.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. I have a very silly little presentation. Okay, great. So my name is Rachel Feltman. I'm the executive editor at Popular Science magazine. Before that, I launched a science blog for the Washington Post called Speaking of Science. And I have my first book coming out on May 17th. It's called Been There, Done That, A Rousing History of Sex. I'm also the host of a Popular Science podcast called The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week, which you can find anywhere you listen to podcasts. And it is what it sounds like. We share weird facts from science, health, and technology from all throughout history, including lots from the Victorian era. So I really hope that y'all enjoy the little sample of my book I'm hoping to share tonight. And then we can do some questions at the end if anyone is interested in discussing anything further. So the history of sex, obviously a very broad topic, much more than you can fit even in a book. So I obviously will not be covering that entire subject this evening, but thankfully, in a lot of ways, you could say that the history of sex starts in the Victorian era. And that is because our oldest evidence of penetrative sex comes in the form of the fossilized remains of Microbrochius dicki. And yes, it's an apt name to be sure, but it has nothing to do with the fact that the 385 million year old fossils have signs of external genitalia. They were actually discovered by one Robert Dick, a Scottish journeyman baker, which by the way means that he had finished his apprenticeship and didn't have a master, but he was not yet quite one himself. So he did his baking on a de jour hiring basis. I just thought that was funny. I assumed journeyman baker meant he took his craft on the road. In fact, not the case. So like many educated individuals in the mid 1800s, he was an avid naturalist, and in his spare time among the many plants and fossils he collected was M. Dickey. And just a few years ago, actually in 2014, researchers examined some long-held M. Dickey specimens and a few new ones, and they found that the males of the species had 8-centimeter long L-shaped bony genital limbs. And they used those to transfer sperm into females. Not to be outdone, the species' better half had small paired bones to lock those genital limbs into place. So this is the first instance of sex as we know it, but it still wasn't really sex as we know it. Paleontologists suspect that these frisky fish would get up alongside each other, put their limbs together, and stay side by side, sort of like square dancing couples doing the do-si-do, which I love. Obviously, we've come a long way. Oh, I hit that slide too quickly. And actually, the history of sex goes back much further than that. While that fossil is for now our earliest evidence of copulation as we know it today, sexual reproduction can occur without do-si-doing. After all, loads of plants reproduce sexually, otherwise bees would be out of the job. So a red algae called Bangiomorpha pubescens, so named because it's the instance of sexual maturity for the first time seen in the world. It's about 1 billion years old, and it's currently considered the oldest known fossilized evidence of sexual reproduction. And just to share one more fun fact from the very, very, very early history of sex in my book before we get into the Victoria era and adjacent eras. I also get into the ongoing discussion of how and why same-sex attraction exists. This is often posed as a paradox or at least like a big problem to solve because the way most of us think about biology boils down to a very simplified version of Darwinism. Stuff sticks around because it helps itself stick around by helping the organisms that carry those qualities reproduce a ton. Now, there's been a lot of really fascinating work unpacking why this isn't necessarily so simple, why it isn't necessarily a conundrum in need of solving. And of course, I do want to add in case it's unclear that, of course, gay people don't need an evolutionary reason to exist, but we can enjoy thinking about why we as a species are often driven to have sex that is not at all procreative, no chance whatsoever. And one really fascinating study on this that I dive into in the book suggests that the key is in flipping our perspective. So instead of asking how same-sex attraction could have managed to spread when it doesn't aid reproduction, maybe the better question is why it didn't disappear. Now, there's no fossil out there that's going to reveal this to be true or untrue, but it's a thought experiment that I really like. Why wouldn't an ancient common ancestor of animals, think like an immobile, simple, but multicellular organism, eukaryotic, like a sea cucumber, just to give you a modern example in the picture. For early life in the primordial ooze, being picky in a sexual sense would have made things really difficult. So what if our OG ancestors were habitually fruity, if you will, biologically speaking? And then the question becomes, why didn't we just stay that way? And the answer isn't simple, but there are a lot of potential answers to that question. Again, I'll save that for the book. My point is that the history of sex goes back at least 1 billion years, and it goes all the way up to the modern day. And it's a lot to go through, more than a whole book's worth. In fact, I'm very upfront about the fact that I provide just an amusing introduction to the subject. So today, I am just going to share some of my favorite factoids from the Victorian era and adjacent periods of history. I love the Victorian era. It makes frequent appearances on my podcast, The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week, because a lot of weird things happened. And while there are many misconceptions about how people felt about sex during this time, a lot of the hangups that we see as normal today were kind of invented in the 19th and early 20th century. So I want to start by talking, excuse me, about queer culture, queer sex, since I have just talked about potentially pansexual cucumbers. So, for example, we know, anyone who knows even a little bit about the Victorian era in England and the US, knows that it wasn't a particularly fun time to be gay. In 1885, the Criminal Law Amendment Act clarified that any male homosexual act in Great Britain, even in private, was punishable by law. And the wording was so vague that it was known as the Blackmailer's Charter, because you could really catch anyone who had wronged you in a potential legal quagmire by accusing them of something or another. So for centuries, in England especially, homosexuality was at best the kind of thing you kept on the down low. But despite centuries of death penalties and condemnation, there's reason to believe that not all everyday citizens took a negative view of homosexuality. So this is a little pre-Victorian, if you'll forgive me, just giving some historical context. So in 2020, historians from Oxford University discovered a diary from 1810 in which Matthew Tomlinson, who was a middle-class farmer, recounted his discussions about and evolving thoughts on gay men. He was mulling over this very scandalous public case. It involved a naval surgeon, and he was sentenced to hang when he was found to be engaging in gay sex. And Tomlinson granted that if homosexuality was a choice and therefore a sin, then some kind of punishment like castration might make sense. But he also laid out facts he collected from conversations with other people, his friends and neighbors, and he seemed to conclude that homosexuality could develop very early in life, and it didn't seem to result from a fall from grace. And he said that if gay men had an inclination and a propensity to be so, then being gay must, quote, then be considered natural. And if the divine creator made gay people, he wondered, what right did the government have to punish them? Tomlinson was, of course, just one man and a man without any power, but that's kind of what intrigues me about him. He was an everyday dude, and he discussed this. He didn't just muse on it. He talked about discussing it with his neighbors, other members of that middle-class social sphere. And it's made historians really curious about how everyday folk might have perceived queerness, which I think is a really important lesson when we reflect on all periods of history, especially sex and especially queer sex, and not just in the days of Jane Austen's England. Even in many instances where a government or even like the ruling class seems to be very opposed to homosexuality, it's very unlikely that every straight person living under the government agreed. Case in point, Anne Lester, she's now much better known because she has been portrayed in a somewhat ahistorical show, Gentleman Jack, but we'll allow it. She's often called the first modern lesbian. And she wrote about her sexual and romantic exploits in Code. But even so, she had a very open relationship with a woman named Anne Walker, who they actually exchanged rings at an Easter communion. They lived together. And so it kind of, it seems unlikely that this was actually so much of a secret. It's hard to know how much of her ability to keep things under wraps was just rich people letting other rich people do their own thing, as long as they were at least somewhat discreet. But also her ability to hide in plain sight was probably due to the country's general disregard of lesbianism. The laws on same-sex activity made no mention of women, because at least some men in power thought that gay women were extremely rare. And in fact, when the British Parliament was considering adding language to laws against gay people about lesbians, as late as 1921, the House of Commons and Lords thought that that would just kind of like spread the word and encourage women to be gay, so that it was better to just never talk about it. They must have had really great relationships with their wives and daughters, is all I have to say about that. Polite society seems to have similarly looked the other way in America. In 1886, Henry James published the Bostonians, which inspired the term Boston marriage. Now, that was often used to imply that women were choosing to live together platonically, They were educated, they had their own money, they didn't need marriage, so they were just living with female companions for comfort. But the couple that James took his primary inspiration from was almost certainly a romantic couple. Annie Adams Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett. They spent 3 decades living together, traveling together, writing some incredibly sappy sapphic poetry about each other, and hosting salons as a couple. So all of this is to say that even the most seemingly buttoned up heteronormative periods of history have had queer people, and not just queer people in the shadows, but queer people thriving and just shaping their lives to fit acceptable social norms of the day. You may be asking, what were all the straight people up to? The answer is that they were making and consuming an awful lot of porn. Just as the internet has allowed 21st century humans to really expand their appetites for pornography, Victorian era technology created a booming new industry for smut. So when the daguerreotype was invented in 1839, it took people probably less than a year, I believe, to start taking pictures of penetrative sex and circulating them. Videos became the norm by the turn of the 20th century. They were pretty clandestine for the first few decades. They were passed around brothels, and it was always just like a very straightforward loop of film, kind of like Tumblr GIFs, because everything comes back around eventually. But of course, the myth that Victorians were buttoned up and prudish doesn't come entirely out of nowhere. Their public sentiments on smut were quite counter, excuse me, to what we know some of their consumption was. Case in point, the British Museum's so-called secretum, which was opened in 1865 in response to the Obscene Publications Act of 1857. Fun fact, that piece of legislation came about when the Lord Chief Justice oversaw a trial related to the sale of pornography at the same time as he was overseeing a trial on the sale of poison. And that really got his brain juices flowing. And he famously declared that smut peddlers were engaged in a sale of poison more deadly than prussic acid, strychnine, or arsenic, which is demonstrably not true. But his solution was to introduce a bill that outlawed the sale of porn outright, though he very reasonably targeted obscenity and then failed to define what counted as obscene, which caused an awful lot of scrambling at places like the British Museum that were suddenly concerned that they might lose ownership of their artifacts to the government by nature of them being deemed obscene. So they decided that just to be safe, they would put things like this goat sex statue in a different room. I'm gonna move on to a next slide because that is I really don't like that statue. So according to the British Museum, upon its creation, the secretum contained around 200 objects that they had labeled as abominable monuments to human licentiousness. A mature and moral gentleman, however, could enter this smutty sanctum to view, along with the goat sculpture you just saw, examples of Pompey's obsession with phalluses, some old-timey condoms, and sexual themes plucked from the walls of an Indian temple, and this statue, which is very clearly not porn. It is a beautiful statue from a culture other than Britain. But again, nobody defined what was obscene, so it was very much in the eye of the beholder, and that led to a lot of artifacts being hidden away because of nudity or other things that we now consider pretty typical in artwork. I get a lot into the fact that the definition of porn remains almost impossible in my book. So And it was quite common, by the way, for reputable institutions to keep anything vaguely spicy behind a curtain or a rope. This was not the only major museum that had a secret room or secret cabinet that gentlemen of fine, upstanding moral character were allowed to go walk around in. I also have a bit in my book about things that now would be considered kind of like sideshow exhibits where, well, sort of a sideshow exhibit meets natural history museum science exhibit, because that was the kind of thing that they just had in the Victorian era, which is great. So there would be models of various body parts, various ailments, maybe a crime scene. And whenever they had something that was like a little too closely related to sex or the female body, they would often sort of put it in another room, and it would be very wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Only the most reputable of noble gentlemen are allowed to come into this room because they have the moral fortitude to not be led astray by this wax mold of a vagina, for example. This was also around the time that physicians were absolutely obsessed with getting people to stop masturbating. This is one of the my favorite parts of the book. Famously, this led Seventh-day Adventist John Harvey Kellogg to design a cereal that relieved constipation so effectively that he thought that people would never masturbate again. The story is often misrepeated as being that it was because it was a bland cereal. He thought that that wouldn't excite people, but in fact, he thought constipation specifically was a slippery slope into carnal desire. So he also had a sanitarium that featured many varieties of enemas and chairs designed to literally shake a good bowel movement out of you. Absolutely not a joke. And he and his brother had a falling out over adding sugar to cornflakes because his brother realized that the American people were not going to flock to the stores to buy cereal where the selling point was bowel movements so good you'll never want to have sex again. And just to wrap up with one more misconception about this point in history, we have the now infamously contentious origin story of the vibrator. This is a picture from the play, I believe it's called The Other Room, and subtitled the Vibrator play. So yes, Joseph Mortimer Granville did invent an electric handheld vibrator in the 1880s. And there has long been a belief, based on what now seems to be some fairly dicey historical analysis, that Mortimer Granville intended for this to be used to replace manual pelvic massaging that had supposedly been performed by male physicians to cure women of hysteria. Historian Hallie Lieberman has a great analysis of this in her book Buzz. You can also, she's written some great articles on it, including for the New York Times. And I've also done some of my own research on this. And indeed, Mortimer Granville said on several occasions quite explicitly that he did not want women to use this vibrator at all, and certainly not for sexual pleasure. The list of things that he thought could be cured with his vibrator was extensive and absurd, and female hysteria was not on the list. It's really fascinating to me. I think this issue, this misconception, this urban legend, it kind of gets at the heart of the misconceptions about sexuality in the Victorian era, because imagine legions of adult women being so completely ignorant of the mechanics of an orgasm that they flock to male doctors to make them happen. Lieberman has pointed out in a lot of her writing that if you reverse the genders of the recurring myth, it starts to sound really, really ridiculous. It really infantilizes and desexualizes Victorian women who we know were talking about sex and thinking about sex in much the same way we do today, though things were a little more buttoned up in public. I think part of why people loved this story so much and why it took off with so little evidence to support it is that it plays into our belief that our recent ancestors were stupid and silly and backwards in a way that we have managed to overcome. And in my book, Been There, Done That, A Rousing History of Sex, I make a really earnest effort to show that actually there's absolutely nothing new under the sun. And history is a series of progressions and regressions and loop-de-loops and brilliant cultural revolutions. So maybe instead of making the mistake of assuming that we got to where we are today through some kind of logical, linear, forward-moving progression, we should learn from the best history has to offer, some of which is way better than what we have going today, for what it's worth, and endeavor to live our lives to the fullest and be good to one another instead of making fun of our goofy Victorian great grandparents, etc. So yeah, Been There, Done That, A Rousing History of Sex is out May 17th, 2022. You can pre-order ebook, hardcover, or audiobook wherever you buy books. And you can find links on rachelfeltman.com. And also, again, if you're into weird history about sex or about anything else, definitely check out my podcast, The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week. And that is my talk. If we want to open it up to questions.
Oh, thank you so much.
However you want to handle that.
Yeah,
of
thank
course.
you. So yes, please, if you have any questions, type them in the chat and I will read them out to the group. So I have a few just to start with.
Perfect.
And I just wondered, with this being your first book, why did you choose this topic to write about, since it's such a massive topic?
Yeah, great question. I was originally going to write a book just about the history of sexually transmitted infection. It was still going to be funny and goofy. That was definitely going to be a more niche, funny, goofy book. And to be honest, just someone beat me to it. Believe it or not, there was somebody else also working on a book proposal about sexually transmitted infections that was ostensibly going to be funny. It is now out. I have not read it yet, but I have heard it's great. And so I just decided, why not broaden my scope? And on The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week, what I love about that show is that I'm able to really take some deep dives into some very bizarre rabbit holes in history. So I realized that actually, getting a little bit broader so that I could talk about some cultural stuff where the weirdest stories are would be really a perfect fit.
So what types of sources did you use to write this book? I'm sure things that you wanted to use, you were probably affected by COVID closures and access, but what?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, luckily I was working on the proposal for a very long time. So I did get to read a lot of primary sources at the New York Academy of Medicine. Pre-COVID, I had a couple of very magical days there, handling frighteningly old books. Really astonishing what they'll let you get your hands on, and anybody can make an appointment there. So I highly recommend it. I ended up at one point having to frantically Google how to retie the bow that had been holding a 600-year-old book together. And again, I was like, this is not, why did you hand this to me? Anyway, I managed to not damage any ancient medical texts, so that was great. But in addition to that, honestly, just, I trained as a science journalist, so I'm very used to spelunking through academic papers on pretty much any subject, and I did an awful lot of that. And then reading a lot of really well-researched books that were just not trying to be funny. And also talking to a few scientists. I don't, it's not a very quote heavy book. That's not the direction I went in, but during my research phase, before I quite knew what form the book was going to take, I did definitely, just call up some folks to talk about their research. So some of that is woven in there as well.
Great. So we have an audience question. So Ember says, I like that you talk about dispelling myths, and so much of what we've learned is that Victorian society was extremely repressed and controlled around sex. Did you find that this was the case, or again, is that a myth that we believe based on the literature that we've studied from that time?
Yeah, I love that question. And I will say, full disclosure, I don't focus on the Victorian era in the book. Like I said in the beginning, it's a lot of history to get through. And kind of, I think, as little as many misconceptions as there are about sex in the 19th and early 20th century, it has been much better covered than a lot of the eras that I was pulling from. That being said, from what I have read and what I did include in the book, I think the answer is complicated. I think much like today, there's what is considered polite in mainstream society, and then there's what is acceptable for you to do as an individual. So I think a lot of the misconceptions we get about how buttoned up and heteronormative and anti-sex and afraid of sex and intimacy Victorian people were, a lot of that is from, I think, just a lot of popular culture sort of acting like in their own homes, people behaved the same way they did when they were like hanging out with the queen. Obviously that's an exaggeration, but I think it would be like, one example I give in the book, not for the Victorian era, but there's not a lot of porn from ancient Egypt. And that's something that there's been some very interesting discussion on. And in part of the book, I say, maybe it's kind of the equivalent of us walking into a library and not seeing any copies of Girls Gone Wild and thinking that means we don't watch porn in the mid-aughts, so I think, again, it's just kind of like, what sources are you looking at? What cultural and social context is this in? Because again, the idea that they're buttoned up doesn't come from nowhere. There were a lot of very sexist norms. There were a lot of very arbitrary social norms. It definitely was not a place where you could be out and proud gay or even just promiscuous. That being said, that people were definitely into sex. So again, I think it's that kind of public versus personal nuance that gets kind of flattened in a lot of popular culture.
So our next question is from Tessa. She wonders, in the mid-19th century, how much sexual abuse did women suffer during so-called medical examinations by doctors?
Yeah, that's an incredibly important question, and one that I don't know that there's been much research into. It's not something I cover in the book. I definitely try to dispel that myth of the giggling married woman who's never had an orgasm going to the doctor for a pelvic massage. But I think it's an excellent point that the flip side is, if that did happen, that there are some really disturbing implications for that. So I don't have a good answer, but I think sexual violence has been an issue in society for as long as pleasurable sex has also existed in society.
And did you find that class structure plays a role in the sexual culture of the time?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this particular era is not one I focused on. I definitely recommend Kate Lister, who runs Whores of Yore, the Twitter account and blog, and has published several books. She has a new one out or coming out, excuse me, specifically about the history of sex work. And I think that is a really important lens in looking at class differences in sexuality, because you do see, looking back in history, in time periods where there was that repression in polite society, there often was, the bawdier sexual culture was had a lot to do with people from different classes and sex workers specifically. There were the people who were allowed to be sexy out and about, and the people who could only do that in the privacy of their own homes.
So did you have a favorite period that you liked, researching the book? Definitely, it doesn't have to be Victorian, but was there one that was that you found easier to write, or that had more humor to incorporate? What?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard because I didn't end up formatting the book chronologically. I did it based more topically. I would say my favorite chapter topically was the one about masturbation, because the cultural norms around that have been so arbitrary, and effort to police it have gotten both very dark and very comical, because it is nigh impossible to police something that someone does with their own person. I also really enjoyed my chapter about our surprisingly brief history of actually understanding how pregnancy and conception work, and the many efforts to control that and understand that throughout history, because I do think there is this misconception that desire to decouple sex from procreation is new and the result of some moral decline, or whatever, but it's quite old. People have wanted to sometimes have sex without worrying about having a baby forever. So
so unless anybody else has any other questions to type into the chat, I have one final one. So what, if there's some other tidbit from your book that you would like to share with us, that it definitely doesn't have to be Victorian related, but some fun note to end on.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what's fun without being really gross to end on. I'm flipping through the book. Oh, I mean, one fun thing is that I talk a lot about non-human animals, and how there has been a long history of natural scientists projecting their own cultural norms onto the way they write about animal behavior. For example, there was some work on Adelaide penguins. I want to say it was early 20th century, and they did engage in some same-sex behaviors as juveniles, as many animals do. And I think it was again the British Museum, they would not let the Antarctic researcher published that part. They like cut everything out about the penguins being gay because they were like, that's a bridge too far, good sir. And there's a lot of that throughout natural history. So I think, there's kind of been, I think there's kind of a like impulse for people to be like, oh, we're trying to project the fact that everybody's queer now on animals and every time the penguins get married at the zoo. And yes, we do anthropomorphize, and it is like, it doesn't actually, penguin sometimes being gay doesn't tell us anything one way or the other about humans being gay, but it is just as true that like for hundreds of years a bunch of researchers, mostly white British men, were like, oh, no, absolutely not. We can't write that down. So again, important reminder that whatever the norms of the day are, do color the way scientists record and present information. And so it is important to like pull all of that historical context when you are trying to figure out what's normal and what's not. And as my book tries to convey, there isn't really normal. I was talking to a NASA flight scientist recently, not about sex. It was about having IBS in space, very kind of stuff I like to write about. And he told me that working as a NASA flight surgeon has taught him that if somebody seems normal, they just haven't been examined closely enough, because there is no normal human being. And after writing this book, that's also the way I feel about sex. There's no such thing as normal sex. There's just what we have decided doesn't weird us out. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you for a really fun night this Valentine's week. I'm sorry my internet was so crummy, but there are links in the chat to buy the book through bookshop.org, and it helps to support the Victorian Society. They share some of the profits with us and with Rachel, so it's nice to go local. And there are also 2 links for our upcoming talks and tours. So Monday, February 28th, Dressing Up, the Women Who Influenced French Fashion, will be an online Zoom talk. And then we have a curator-led tour at Poster House on March 28th of a woman designer, Ethel Reed. And that exhibition is opening later this month. So that should be a lot of fun. And please check out our our website for other upcoming events.